They were selling children in Ridgewater like they sold broken tools and last season's whiskey. The plank floor of the saloon had the slick shine of spilled beer and old grief. Men leaned on the bar like they were part of it, faces burned toward the poker lamp, voices gone low and mean. A boy in a blood-stained shirt counted out coins at the judge's bench. A woman with a scarred cheek read names off a slip of paper. The thing in the middle of that room, small as a crate and just as exposed, did not belong there. Caleb Frost had come down the road for rope and nails and a new patch for the stovepipe. He had meant to keep his back to the town. That was the promise he had made when he walked away from Ridgewater the last time. Keep the valley close, keep his hands clean of whatever the town sold and took. He stood in the doorway smelling tin and smoke and a dozen other small combustions of life, and something in the saloon's voice tugged at a place he had tried to let go. He had left a life of photographs in a trunk and a grave with two names, Emma and Sarah. The names lived like a pair of stones in him, some nights heavier than the saddle on his horse, some mornings nothing but a cold, empty hollowness that made him start the stove twice to be sure he still could. He had thought exile would be enough. It was not. The auction had the raw economy of a market in collapse. Debts were an animal with teeth. Men needed money. Women with litters of children were risk and cost. The auctioneer had a way of making everything that was sold sound like a bargain. He described the child's hands, the child's health, the child's use. None of the words fit the little girl standing against the wall, whose hair had been tied in a single clumsy braid, and whose eyes kept roaming the room as if reading every face for threat. She did not cry. People at auctions learned not to give the show away. Her legs were thin as the bars of a chair. Her feet were bare. She kept a small tightness in her mouth as if she were holding back a thing that had once been a voice. Caleb felt his body move before his head could command it. He had not meant to cross the saloon, had not meant to put himself where decisions got made, but then he had been closer than the low lamp, and those small searching eyes had looked straight at him, and he read there what every father would have read if he had been allowed those names. Someone to shield, and the memory of a little laughing fist that had once been his. $20, said the auctioneer, and somebody laughed, and the room circled around the sound like crows. Caleb's hand went cool and steady into his pocket, found the folded bills he had set aside for rope. $20 was the thickness of his guilt, and the width of his shame all at once. He had no right. He knew that. But the world in the saloon had hollows that swallowed indecision. He stepped forward. He had not meant to plead. His voice was a dry thing, unused to speaking in rooms with smoke and expectation, but it cut through anyway. "I'll take her," he said. The words landed wrong, as if he had bought a hammer instead of making a choice about a life. The auctioneer's grin sharpened. Men who wanted to be rid of guilt cheered as if he had done them a favor. Someone demanded to know if he was sure. Men wanted spectacle. Women wanted profit. But the girl, the one the saloon had been selling like it was a loaf, watched him with nothing but a small curated wariness. As someone took the money and wrapped a cord around the papers, the room's attention shifted away like tides. When the bidding settled and the lamp clipped low and the laughter slid back into the corners, everyone else returned to their drinks. Only the girl looked up at him and asked, plain and small in the middle of the city's noise, the question that would cut him open later, that evening and years from then. "What will you do to me?" It was not a rhetorical thing, not a child's curiosity. It was a ledger kept of all the pain she'd measured. It was the kind of directness that had no room for his excuses. In the hush, the words clung to him. Men in the doorway snorted as if at a joke. Caleb could not meet the girl's eyes. He felt the gravity of the question pull at something that had been turned to stone in him. He had paid $20. He had taken her from what they called a sale. He had bought nothing. He had stolen an hour in which to do right. "Nothing I won't fight to stop," he said. The voice came out rougher than he intended. He did not say he had saved her, because he knew how that sounded. He could not make absolution. He could only make a promise out of his hands and his name and the fact of his oath in that room. They left Ridgewater with the night as a dense curtain behind them and the horse huffing between the posts. The town's lamps faded into a scatter of yellow and then into nothing. Wind from the ridge kissed at his face, bringing with it the note of crushed pine and the hard, clean smell of winter thawing at the edges. The girl sat on the small folded blanket in the back of his wagon, hands pressed into her lap like a prayer she had meant never to speak aloud. The road home creaked under the wheels. Foxfire lay in the ditch like a phantom. They did not speak because neither one knew the right grammar. Caleb kept watching her in the corner of his eye, how she blinked at the passing dark, how her shoulders rose and fell like the slow mechanics of a bird's wings. He felt like an intruder in a life that had been closed to him for years. He had kept a trunk where he had thought to keep only relics. In the cabin, the trunk lived against the wall of the loft, beneath a pair of broken kerosene lamps. When he lifted the lid, the air smelled like the past. Lavender and moth-eaten wool, a faint trace of children's chalk. He moved carefully, as if the things inside confessed to him one by one. There were 2 nightgowns folded on top, blue and specked with tiny embroidered stars at the collar. Emma's hand had stitched them. One had a faint burn on the hem from a stove that had been too hot the night they fought over the lamp. Under them lay a small carved robin, its beak tipped with red paint, which he had whittled for Sarah with his waiting hands. He set the carvings near the stove and passed the blue gown to the girl without thinking where his hands had learned the gentleness. She took it with the same careful fear she had used when picking loose bread from a pan. Her fingers brushed the fabric. It was the second time she had been given something that had no ledger attached. One was his purchase, the other a gift folded from memory. Her skin was colder than it should have been. He wrapped the gown around her shoulders as if he could make a house of it. "You can have it," he said. The sentence sounded absurdly small and large at once. He had not offered shelter before. He had offered food and roofs, and the same stale apologies he had used for years. Now he watched the girl consider the gown like a map to a strange country. "Will you make me wear it?" she asked, tentative, testing the world for comic cruelty. "No," he said. "Wear it if you want to. Take it off if you don't." Her name, the one that would settle for a while like dust, had been called out raw at the auction. Laya. He did not know whether it was a name of birth or of debt. It sounded wrong in his mouth. He tested it once and set it in the small crook where names stayed, to be used sparingly and with care. The first night the cabin kept a thin, fragile peace. He fed her a stew that tasted mostly of potatoes and the faint smoke of the hearth. She ate with a concentration that made him think she had never been taught how to take pleasure in food. She ate as if survival was a lesson, and she was still learning the grammar. When the stew passed, she watched the fire close enough that the heat painted her face orange. The small robin lay on the table, and he had the sudden urgency to hand it to her. "That was for my girl," he told her. He did not mean his voice to break, but it did. He had said the words aloud to admit what he had thought he had buried. For a long moment she simply looked at him, the way someone might examine a fissure in a wall and decide whether it held spirits. "Do you miss them?" she asked finally. Children had a bluntness for truth. Her question had the clean edge of curiosity without pity. The air in the cabin held 2 different kinds of ache. "Every day," he said. He did not add the nights and the hollow that sat in the place where their names lived. He didn't say he had thought himself unfit to keep loving anyone. He did not say that loving had broken something in him and that the money he had paid could never fix that. She considered him, and then she touched the robin. Her fingers stilled on the wood. "I had a wooden horse once," she told him. "It lost a wheel, and my uncle tied rope around it until it wouldn't roll. He said things break because people need to make room." He had come to the cabin wanting to be a hermit. He wanted the scaffolding of craft and weather and silence. Instead, he was stalking the nearest empty place in himself with the small human business of attention. He wrapped a blanket around her and watched until the line of her breathing steadied. He slept at the edge of the bed like a man who had learned to take only a small corner of whatever piece lay near him. The girl's question, the one from the saloon that had stopped men talking, became a bell in him. He heard it at odd hours. "What will you do to me?" It asked not about the future, but what he would allow the past to do to her. He had no answer that fit the ledger in his head. Only an accumulation of acts could answer it. Feed, stitch, teach, stay. Days made their own work. Wood had to be split and stacked, traps checked, the horse fed every morning and brushed so that it would tolerate the cold. The valley taught a kind of routine that had steadiness built into it. The chores became the grammar for life in which trust might be learned. He taught her how to lift a root and how to bend a nail and how not to be afraid of the rifle when it was needed. He taught her to carve. He set a scrap of pine between them and showed her how the grain told you which way the knife would go. Laya's hands were careful. She made a small bird at first, and then tried to rasp its edges until the wood felt like a shape with eyes. He watched her shape the bird, and felt something like a thaw in himself. "You should whittle steady," he told her, handing her the small knife with the certainty that came from long doing. "Let the grain tell you. Don't fight the wood." She looked up at him and smiled, for the first time that felt not like a reflex but like something that had been stored. It was a small rearrangement of her face, a loosened muscle. He noticed, like a man noticing the first green on a branch. The first laugh came out as a hiccup. She tried to hide it behind the palm of her hand. They measured progress in tiny increments. She would not come near the bed of flour at first. Then one morning she would roll a palm into the dough and laugh when it stuck cold and white to her fingers. She would sleep longer some nights. Night terrors came and left in the way storms passed, sudden and devastating, then a grey dawn with the smell of wet wood. Once in the depth of one such night, she woke and called out without the practiced silence, "I don't want to," and his heart ground to a halt at what the end of that sentence might have been. He did not speak the words that would make them both more exposed. Instead, he learned to press his hand into the small of her back and wait like the mountain wind that would not let the cliff feel alone. She curled into him, and the night softened by a fraction. There was gratitude in the small human business of it, and he held that like a new coin. Ridgewater came back to him in small increments. People recognized him in the supply store or at the corral. Rumor, a more dangerous creature than hunger, moved with the speed of a gull. He bought flour in the morning and a roll of thread at noon, and found himself answering the same question over and over. "Who is she?" He answered with the same blunt necessity, as if it were about a mare. "She is with me." That was true, and also not the whole story, a hedged truth, but it kept them safe enough for a while. Margaret Hawthorne watched him with a woman's eye that catalogued harm and what might be done for it. She had a small shop on the main street, a room with jars of cured herbs and a cat that liked to sleep on the counter. Caleb had known Margaret by sight for years. People recognized him as the man who had stopped coming around after the funeral. The first time he walked into her shop with Leah, wrapped in the blue gown like a secret he was not sure he had a right to, Margaret looked at them both and did not ask anything not needed. "You look like you might need bandages," she said, reaching for a tin. She did not question how he had come by the child. That would not have helped. She supplied stitches and an aspirin and a bowl of thin soup he could buy cheap. She closed the shop door as if the room were a confessional and left the talking for later. "I can't keep her on the account," he said quietly. "I used my rope money." Margaret set the bowl down as if the bowl were a theological thing. "Then you used your rope money for better than rope," she said. Her words were not a blessing, and they were not a permission. They were a ledger kept by a woman who saw debt and saw ways to pay it without making sinners of them. People were not all judgment, though plenty were. Some were worse. At the edge of the town, whispers took the shape of a name, Boone, Silas Boone. Caleb had known the name as something to avoid. The Boones were like a family of knots. The more you pulled, the harder it became to undo them. Jasper Boone was a man buried and blamed and named. Silas carried his own debts on his face. He had hands that didn't mind holding a ledger, and men who would sign for him if need be. For now, though, Ridgewater bowed its head and turned to other business. There were miners with frozen hands and a sheriff who loved a clean ledger. They had other things to fight over. For the few weeks that followed, it was enough that Caleb and Leah had small rituals. They had breakfast at the table where 2 cups sat, and one of them, Leah's, was chipped at the rim. He taught her to tie his laces the way he had learned in boyhood, with a double knot that would hold in the mud. He showed her how to bait a trap with the indifferent hands of a man who had done waking tasks his whole life. He did not call himself her father. He feared the name like someone fearing a line of frost at the lip of a garden. Names meant things, but the word kept curling up in small places between them, in the half-formed sentences, and the way she shortened his name to Cal sometimes when she was working. He answered without protest when she finally, one wet evening, slid small fingers into his and said, "Don't ever go away." "Not if I can help it," he said. It was not a promise he measured in legal forms. It was the weight of his life set on a small human thing. He didn't argue with the word that trembled in him. the whisper that perhaps a soft thing could fit into the hollow he had kept for so long. Months are not a smooth thing. There were backward steps. A trap failed and the fox got away. A storm blew in earlier than the almanac promised, and the roof leaked in 2 places. Night terrors would re-emerge with a fierceness that left both of them raw. A week of too much rain made the cabin smell like old wool, and made Leia climb into his lap in the middle of the night and ask too many small questions until dawn. Each setback required work to repair. The patch on the roof, the stitching of the seam, the calming voice that did not scold, but instead laid a slow, steady hand on the child's back. The question from the saloon continued its quiet demand. Sometimes it came in an evening, when he would find a carved, not quite robbed bird on the table, its paint clumsy. Leia would leave small offerings, a pebble, a feather, the tail of a blue ribbon she had found caught in the hedgerow, and he thought about exchange and debt, and what you were allowed to give to someone in order to make them yours. "How long will I be safe?" she asked once, the string of words more practical than poetic. She had been watching the lines along his face as if reading a map, and now she asked for the city's cleanest ledger. Length of safety. He did not lie. "As long as no one takes you by force," he said. He did not say that even that guarantee was a thin thing. He did not say what he knew about people like Silas. He told her about the sheriff and about Margaret and about staying where the land was hard to walk at night. He taught her how to make herself small and how to listen at the window for the sound of a rider, how to make sure the horse was tied in such a way it could not be stolen quietly. She listened like someone assembling a plan. Her face would tighten while her small hands learned to tie knots and to set the small traps. Teaching her to hold the rifle was another kind of arithmetic. He did not like the idea of a child with a weapon, and yet survival asked for measures that were not all moral. He showed her how to check and clean it, how to take enough care to be dangerous without being wanton. The rifle became, for him, another way of handing over the ability to answer a question about harm. A weapon did not save a soul, but it made some kinds of theft harder. There were nights when he sat on the porch and watched the valley breathe out in fog. He would press his palm to the small robin on the table and think of the knot that is memory. The carved bird had lost paint where his thumb had rubbed at it in nervousness. He had given things to his past, like tokens, and had been refused a return. Giving to Leia felt differently, less an attempt to buy absolution, and more the small stubborn business of making something steady where it had been unmade. One day, near the end of March, when the snow was only a memory in the hollows, and the air smelled like wild onion shoots pushing up through thawed ground, Margaret came up the lane to the cabin. She had a satchel and an expression that suggested tidings, and not all of them gentle. She carried with her a small jar of salve, and the news of the town like a knife wrapped in cloth. "You've done a brave thing to take her," she said without preamble, and the plainness of it hit him like the wind. Not the kind of brave that shows for ribbons. Brave like a person who knows how the world will look at them and does it anyway. He did not know how to reply. He had not wanted praise. He had wanted to be anonymous in his rescue. The truth of it was less glamorous. He had come because he could not bear another child's face in a room for sale. "Silas Boone been asking around?" Margaret said. Her voice tightened. "He keeps asking who's got a woman-child down the road. Says he owes a favor to some folk, and what's more, Jasper's kin. He don't like loose ends." Caleb's hands tightened on the rim of the coffee cup Margaret offered. There was a small heat to his face he had not felt in a year. The thought of being found, of the ledger of the Boones landing at his door, was a practical terror. He thought of the girl's eyes at the auction and how they had measured him like a man in a suit of obligations. "What will he want?" Leia asked, quieter than a twig. "He'll want what he thinks of as his," Margaret said. She watched the pair like a woman who had seen misfortune make its rounds before. "You did more than buy a child, Caleb. You put yourself in the way of a storm." He did not bless himself. He felt the cost slide into a pocket of his bones like a stone you don't notice until you try to run. He had not bought a person. He had signed his name to a direction. Now the town, the place he had promised never to let have place in his life again, had elements that would not be placated by promises or by a patched roof. He sat with Margaret and considered. The afternoon thinned out into a cool light that made things more honest. He thought of the girl's question and felt it like a horseshoe pressed into his own palm. What would he do to her? He had paid money, but money could not stop thugs or silence men who thought themselves entitled. "We'll do what has to be done," he told Margaret. He did not say what. He would not promise more than that he would not let her be taken without a fight. That night the valley held its breath. Stars were pinpricks in the sky, bright and disinterested. Laia slept with the blue gown tucked close, the robin at the foot of the bed like a small carved guard. Caleb sat up by the stove and listened. The question came again in the dark, stripped of the theatre of the saloon, raw as a new wound. "What will you do to me?" He let the silence answer. He had learned that actions were heavier than words. He had learned, too, that actions could be haunted by the past. He thought about the lesson his father had taught him. Keep the gate closed, keep the fire fed, keep the promise that you will be the kind of man who does not turn away. The tracks would come in the next days. He did not know yet how many or how hard the ground would be for them. He only knew that the valley had no interest in being kind. It moved like weather, indifferent and inevitable. He rose and went to the window and watched the dark like a man who had been told a storm was coming and could not pretend otherwise. Outside, something left a print that did not belong. It was at first a small disturbance in the lane, a boot mark that had not been there the day before. When he knelt to it, he saw the shape of a boot heel and the drag of a spur, and his mouth went small and close. He scraped at the dirt until the sun burned the patience out of him. The mark was fresh, the tread unfamiliar. He traced it with his finger and felt his life narrow to a bright line of decisions. Laia woke when he entered the room. She sat up at once, the way someone does when they expect the world to be abrupt. Her eyes, which had spent days learning to trust stripes of weather and the hush of a new life, flicked to the window and then to him. "Are we going to be taken?" she asked with a child's economy of phrase. "No," he said. He did not let himself mouth the lie. He had to make sure his actions matched the word. "We will be ready. We will not be taken." She believed him because for the moment she wanted to. That small faith would later be tested as stones are tested by frost, but for now the bell of her trust rang clear. He had no plan than the plan of a man who had to be a parent for the first time, to build a house of acts that would answer a question with more than speech. He had to do it because words meant nothing alone. The question would keep coming until his life had enough weight of proof that it could hold her safe. He walked out to the barn and checked the rifle and the saddlebags and the spare provisions. The horse's breath steamed in the air, and the world looked like a place that could be defended by a man with hands and grit. He thought of the $20 folded into his pocket when he had offered it at the auction like a down payment on decency. He had not bought absolution. He had bought a moment in which he would either try to be better or fail. The money did not change the moral arithmetic. What would change it would be the days he chose to stay. At the cabin he made a list out of need. Mend the shutters, nail iron plates to the roof's weak seam, scatter the rock so that a rider could not come fast and unseen. He taught Laia how to pull a rope silently. She learned without hurry, with the deliberation of someone who had been practicing avoidance all her life. He watched the way her hands folded the rope, the care with which she set knots that might one day save a life. Margaret returned before noon. She had a parcel from the town, and a look that had been built by facing things she did not like. She and Caleb spoke in the kitchen like two people coordinating a defense. There were no promises, there were preparations. She left a jar of lamp oil and a spool of heavy thread. She left a note about witnesses in town who would say they had seen the child with him. Small things that might become a scaffold in the future. "You did well to get her off that table," she told him. "But them Boones, they don't like it when people cut their line of business." Caleb's hand went to the blue gown, to the place at the collar where Emma had stitched tiny stars. He fingered the thread until his grip ached, and then he steadied his face. There were ways to do this without being reckless. There were ways to call the sheriff and to document possession and to get signatures and to make the town ledger cooperate with his life. But there were also men who did not care for ledgered law. They spent the afternoon making the cabin less obvious. They stacked extra wood and built a false pile against the back wall that would hide shadows. Laia watched the act of covering with that sort of attention children throw at learning how the world is made. She helped him hammer a board that would make a shelf that could hide a rifle in case of an entry. He taught her how to keep silent when a bird alarm sounded. These were lessons of a practical morality. Do the small things that make the big things impossible. When dusk fell, the silhouette of the ridge seemed dark against the bruised sky. He sat with Laia on his knee, and the robin between them like an emblem. She rested her head against his shoulder, and for a small while the valley allowed them the illusion of safety. He thought about the woman's question in the saloon, and how it had been a map to the rest of his life now. "What will you do to me?" It demanded not vows but victories. He did not know yet how many of those victories he possessed. A rider passed on the road below, a single figure wrapped in a cloak, moving like a small shadow against the wide land. Caleb watched until the sound died away and the night regained its evenness. He thought of the follow-through that would be required. He would not be able to keep the girl if he failed to make the town see what he had done, that he had not made a purchase but had prevented one. He thought of petitions, of witnesses like Margaret, of quiet legalities that could be bent in a place like Ridgewater. He thought too of what men would pay for a child. He fed the horse and checked the locks. He sat up late, with the fire making its slow sound and the robin carved into smallness between his hands. Outside, the valley breathed its old breath. Inside, the house accepted its occupants and learned their rhythms. Caleb had given one answer with a bill on a saloon table. He would have to repay that answer in nights at watch, in stitches and lessons and bravery that was not the boastful kind. He would have to answer the question with the simplest thing a human could offer: presence. When Laia woke before dawn and put her hand to his face like a small anchor, he closed his eyes and promised himself that as long as he lived, he would try to make it so that the question, "What will you do to me?" could be answered by the life he built. He did not know the measure of the coming trials. He only knew that some things, the stitch of a seam, the setting of a boot, the laying of a plank, were the architecture of fidelity. That night became a hinge. The valley kept its old laws, and a new storm was folding into being beyond the ridge. Caleb rose in the dark, wrapped the rifle in oilcloth, and went to the door to watch the world like a man who had found suddenly the exact purpose his hands could fill. The small blue gown lay across a chair like a flag. The robin sat on the table, its paint faded in the right places. He could still hear the saloon's lamp behind his teeth when he breathed. The town's sounds were a long way off. For now, the earth under the cabin held, and the small life within it drew quiet breaths. Footprints showed up in the soft thaw a day later. They would not leave him alone. Footprints showed up in the soft thaw a day later. He found them at dawn, a string of boot marks cutting across the lane like an accusation. The tread was heavy, the spur dragged where the rider had shifted his weight. Caleb knelt and traced the edge of one print with a fingertip until the cold bit through his nail. The impression was recent. The soil had not sun-crusted yet. He sat back on his heels and let the valley fold around him, waiting to see what shape the threat would take. He did not wake Laia with the news. She had learned to sleep with a small rumpled face that could unmake him. Instead, he checked the barn, the tack, the rope, and the stacks of firewood he'd moved to make hide holes and false shadows. He walked the fence line, set a couple of trip snares for a warning, not to hurt a man, but to make sound where silence might have been an ally to those who meant to come by night. He smeared grease on a hinge and placed a length of chain where a door had looked loose before. The boy who had sold and the man who had bought were not the same. One traded in human reckoning, the other tried clumsily to do justice. When Laia opened her eyes, she watched him from the bed like a little captain readying for sea. The blue gown lay across the chair, and the robin sat at the table with its head cocked, a small, silent witness. She dressed slowly, fingers fidgeting at the hem. He met her in the kitchen with a pot of thin coffee that tasted too strong, and 2 slices of stale bread warmed on the pan. "Tracks," he said. The word was simple and flat, the sentence made of the small truth he had to tell her. She listened, and her mouth set. It was not the first time she had been told a thing that required planning. "Will they take me?" she asked. The first part of the saloon's question reversed into the ledger of what might be. "No," he said, and the word was heavy enough to be true. He did not promise ease, he promised readiness, which was the only thing he could give with any measure of certainty. "We make noise, we make witnesses. We do not let anyone come in the night without names." She tied his laces for him the way he'd taught her days before, the double knot tight against the cold. The rhythm steadied him. She had learned how to perform small, definite acts that were a kind of prayer. Margaret kept to her promise. By mid-morning she came up the lane with a basket of fresh bread and a look that had the bluntness of someone who had lived long enough to see what fear looked like on other people's faces. She left the food on the table, sat, and spoke without ornament. "I've lined up 2 who'll swear they saw her with you last week," she said. "Old Man Hollis, who sells oats, and Barlow in the feed. They neither like you nor care for the boons, but they like truth more than trouble." She paused and looked at Caleb. "You'll want to go to the sheriff, file your name down, make it plain what happened at the auction. Don't let rumor do your work." Caleb had been living on a ledger of avoidance. Now he learned to use law like a tool. He packed his coat and a small ledger he kept for receipts and ammunition. He filled a saddlebag with the carved robin wrapped in oilskin, the blue gown folded small, 2 spare shirts, and a fist of coins he had not yet spent. He asked Margaret to watch the cabin and to present herself as witness if anything happened. Her answer was a small curt nod and a hand reaching across the table to close over his. "You keep your life on that line you drew such a while back," she said. "Don't let it shrink." The road to Ridgewater had the same bones it always had: gullied ruts, a lonely creek, a smell of wet coal drifting from the mine. Caleb rode with his head down and his shoulders pulled up as if the valley's weather were trying to pry the words from him. He told the sheriff what little he could without framing the whole as spectacle. Sheriff Ames listened, a man with a face that had been map-lined by patience and a nose for trouble. He asked for names, witnesses, and the sequence of events. "You bought her for $20, the sheriff said finally, not as judgment, but as a matter of fact. "Noted. What you did in that room I've seen men do and regret. But we'll make something official. A temporary declaration of guardianship can be written. It won't take the place of adoption, but it will give us a voice if any of the boons come knocking." Caleb signed his name with a hand that trembled for more than the cold. The paper smelled like ink and authority. It was a thin thing, but in a place where law was often only as strong as the people who enforced it, name on paper mattered. Margaret's account, and Hollis's and Barlow's, swore that they'd seen Leah in Caleb's company in the weeks prior. The sheriff made a note in his large book, cross-hatched the line, and told Caleb to come to town when he could for a more formal deposition, to bring any physical items that would tie Leah to him, the nightgown, the robin, anything that signaled continuity. Caleb returned up the lane with a slip of legal paper in his pocket and a long tight thing in his chest. For a while that note would be enough to give him standing to speak in Ridgewater. It would not make him a father-in-law's eyes, but it would make it more difficult for any man with a ledger and a memory of favors to take her without scrutiny. When he slid back inside the cabin, the wind had changed, and Leah was at the window with her small face pressed against the glass as if she were studying a landscape for treachery. She looked up and gave him a quick, small smile that had the way of a thing saved. He passed her the robin and the gown, the proofs of continuity, and she held them like a covenant. "Did you make it stick?" she asked, and the question had the economy of a ledger man measuring a day's work. "We made it in ink," he said. "It's on the sheriff's book, it's a start, but it won't keep men from trying." Her hands worked the bird's edge as if the carved grain could teach her patience. "If they come," she said, "I'll stand. I can stand." The words were neither brave nor boastful. They were a fact set down. In the afternoon, Margaret brought more than bread. She had a small packet tied with thread and a name scribbled in the margin, witnesses who would appear in the event of a suit. Her face had the knowledge of a woman who traded favors with courage for people she thought worth the trouble. "They can be called to give you voice," she said. "It's not an adoption, but it's a voice. That matters here." Caleb thought about how voice mattered. In the saloon, only coin had spoken. On paper, names could speak louder. He felt the thinness of the guarantee and also the warmth of allies collecting around them like moss around stones. Margaret had more than sympathy. She had a practice of not letting wrong stay unremarked. That was something even a man like Caleb, whose shoulders had been turned away from towns for a long while, could learn to value. The days tightened into habit. They patched curtains, mapped routes for retreat, practiced the small silences of living on watch. Leah learned to hear the different footfalls of the valley, the hoof, the boot, the rodent's scuttle, and to tell them apart in the half-black hours. He taught her how to hide a signal in the chimney smoke, a way for them to say to each other without a word that a stranger was near. And yet the valley kept making its own weather. One night in late April, just as the thaw had creased the last of the drifts into mud and the birches pushed the first pale buds, a rider came at pace down the lane. He pulled up short at the cabin and shaded his eyes against the low sun. Caleb stepped out of the doorway with a rifle across his chest and saw a man he knew by reputation more than face, Silas Boone. Silas had learned the unlit language of those who traded favors and remembered debts. He had the sort of hands that had never worried about how they looked when they were about to demand something. He sat his horse with the gambler's ease of a man who had practiced being unrepentant. Caleb's heart went thin and fast. He had prepared for men with guns. He had not prepared for the kind of man who believed the law was a thing to be bent with threats and a wink. Silas dismounted and leaned the horse's head, a smirk loosening into a smile like a hand slipping into a pocket. "You keep a pretty table, Frost," Silas said. His voice had the pleasantness of a man who was arranging a sale. "She is not for sale," Caleb said. The sentence came out flat as a board. He did not mean to show anger. He meant to show boundary. Now, Silas said, as if conversation could fold itself around the news of his visit. "This isn't about sale, is it? Jasper had some kin he left a little something to. Folks say the girl was with the Boones now, or might be what a man might call a resource." He let the word hang like a coin. Caleb watched the way Silas's eyes moved like a man looking down the seam of a fence to see how high it might be climbed. He stepped between Liah and the man without thinking about how near the barn was or how tired his hands might be. "I already told you what she is with me," he said. "She's under the sheriff's temporary guardianship." Silas's smile narrowed like a trap. "Sheriff's ink only goes so far, friend. Paper is paper. Money is flexible." Margaret came out from the back of the cabin with a pot of nettle stew and the businesslike set to her mouth that made odd things called brave look plain. "Silas," she said, "you know why you shouldn't be stirring old debts. Not in my town." Silas's jaw tightened for a sliver of annoyance, and then he laughed. "You and your shop talk as if the world were a place for angels," he said. "There's business to do. Men get by how they can." He left then, with the carriage of a man who wanted to make his presence known, without starting a fight in which witnesses might get involved. He rode off as if he'd left nothing but a shadow. The mood the man took with him stung like cold rain. Caleb closed the door and locked it, turned the key in a motion he'd learned in other times of danger, and felt the hollow behind his ribs fill with a new kind of resolve. The next week silenced itself into the repetition of watch and rope and meal, but a quickness had settled into the air as if everyone waited for a bell to ring. They made contingency plans, an agreed signal by whistle to rouse a neighboring farm, a route for Liah in the event of a surprise, a message to the sheriff to keep an ear open. Margaret wrote a letter to the county reader asking for the matter to be noted, a small bureaucratic lighthouse in case men with memory tried to navigate by rumor alone. Then the night came that everything counted. It began with the smell of wet wool and smoke. Liah woke, first by reflex, then by the hand-calculated knowledge of someone who had learned to attend to small changes. The cabin's outer darkness had a new thickness. She stood and cupped her ears and heard something she had learned to be suspicious of. A slow, deliberate tread toward the back shed, a scrape that was precisely the sound of a boot on wet wood. Her heart tapped a steady rhythm against her ribs, the same rhythm a man might feel when he found his horse was stolen at dawn. She slid from the bed like a shadow and reached for the rifle on the rack they had made to be easy to get but hard to find by accident. Her hands were steady. The training had become muscle memory. She felt the weight of the weapon, and the cold of the barrel, and the way the scent of oil had been woven into its stock. Caleb was at the window, his face a black cut in the glass. He caught her eye and nodded once, the simple signal they'd agreed. The house hummed with the kind of silence that is its own noise. Then the first shot cracked the dark. It slammed into the world like someone slamming a fist into a door. The porch light sang, and a splinter showered down. Liah ducked and fired back, not from practiced aim but from the pure necessity of someone who understood that breath and decision must coincide. The men at the door, 2, 3, moved with the kind of rough, practiced violence that made no promises of softness. One struck at the latch with a pry bar, and another tried to leap onto the porch. Caleb moved like a man who had learned how to make his body into a statement. He pushed a heavy crate against the door with his shoulder and took a shot through a narrow slat, the rifle finding a space between board and night. He took careful, measured breaths and anchored them in the ground. He was not a young man who thought himself invincible. He was a man who understood his breath and had refined his aim by necessity. The attackers moved in ways that made the cabin a bad place for them. They had expected an easy thing, a child and a reclusive man, no one to take offense. They had counted wrong. Lia's shots rang out and missed the braggart glee the attackers might have hoped for. Caleb's first wound came as a hot, blunt fire across his shoulder. He felt the shock, and then the world turned sharp at the edges. His breath came in a startled grab, and then steadied because there was no time to panic. One of the men breached the porch and came up with a knife. Caleb met him at the threshold. Their bodies pressed against the doorway and time condensed into the tightness of hands and the slipperiness of blood under the skin. The man slashed, and Caleb stepped aside and felt the cold pull of a thinness at his side. He faltered, and for a terrible second, the cabin seemed absurdly full of small things. Lia's small fingers wrapped around the rifle, the robin on the table, the blue gown still hanging on a peg. He thought of the question the girl had asked in the saloon years back, and felt it strike him like a bell. "What will you do to me?" He did not have a long time for language. He had a handful of moves and the fierce determination to keep a promise made under worse witnesses than the sheriff's ink. He shoved the man back with a cry and felt the world tilt. He saw Lia step forward, steadier than a stone, and aim with an accuracy that belied her years. The crack of the rifle built in the air like thunder and then settled. The man dropped, and the porch took a sudden, horrible quiet where once there had been noise. Caleb's breath stung with the cold of air taken through a new wound. He felt a spatter of warmth where someone had cut him. The world blurred to the edges and sounded like the distant rush of rain. Lia's hands shook but did not leave the rifle. She looked at him with a face that had the mixture of terror and decision that people get when they finally move to do what has to be done. "Hold," she said, the command small and immediate. He tried to nod and the motion came out ragged. Margaret's shout came then, a sound like a bell, and a second later the door burst open to reveal the blurred faces of men who were not with the attackers. Margaret with a lamp, and behind her Sheriff Ames with 2 deputies. The sheriff's face was like a plough in a field, set, weathered, and not easily moved. The deputies moved with the formal necessary speed of men who had practiced law and sawed it into the messy reality of bullets and wounds. One of them bound the wound at Caleb's side with a clean bandage Margaret pressed tight with her hands. The sheriff herded bodies into the yard where they could be secured without further harm. The attackers, surprised by the speed of authorities, found their courage thin. Some tried to run, some were seized, and some lay groaning where their pride had been broken. After the shots stopped, the cabin seemed unbearably small, the air thick with the iron taste of blood and the scent of gunpowder. Caleb tasted copper and gratitude and something like fear all at once. He sat on a chair and held his arm against his chest, as if he could press the wound closed by intention. Lia sank to the floor and wrapped her arms around his knees as if she could anchor him there, as if the act of holding might stop the world from running away. "You're going to be all right," she told him, "because there are some lies the living tell to steady one another, and some truths that depend on the will to be kept." "It's just a scratch," he lied back, and the lie was both conceit and gift. He felt Margaret's hands on his head, and the sheriff's words like a slow gearing down of the immediate danger. "They came for a child," the sheriff said after a while, the prose of his job coming through like a map. "They'll be booked. You'll make statements. We'll mark it self-defense where the evidence points that way." Self-defense. Caleb tried to think about the words and felt them like the warmth of a metal spoon. They could be official, but they would never be all the story. They would be paper and ink that responded to a moment of thunder. They would not touch the ledger in his chest of what he'd done and why he'd done it. When the men were taken and the deputies led Boots across the yard and into Ridgewater, Margaret stayed and worked like a midwife of small mercies. She boiled water and applied salves, and drove out the worst of the fire smell with stuff she kept in her satchel. She peeled the shirt from Caleb's chest with hands that had seen many things, and had the care of someone who understood how wounds need to be tended in body and in reputation. "He's muddled," she said finally to Lia and the sheriff. "But he'll live. He needs rest." Leah sat up through the night, watching the edge of the bed where Caleb slept, and breathed like a man who had been given back and was learning the measurement of it all. She had blood on her hands from the grips, and the sight of it frightened her not because of guilt, but because of the reality of life's edges. She moved small cups of broth and kept a rag with cold water near his face. When he woke with the fever in the small hours, she was there and said simply, "You promised." He tried to answer with words and failed, so he pressed his hand to the back of her head and felt the warmth there like a claim. The girl's question from the saloon haunted him in the way of a bell that will not be silenced. "What will you do to me?" He had answered it not with a word, but with a wound taken in her stead, and with the long trailing hours of care that followed. He had given that answer in his body as much as in his life. Recovery moved slantwise and slow. Caleb's wound was not fatal, but it left him the way such things do, less able to move fast, slower at the chores he'd once done by force of habit. He grew leaner because he could not lift like he used to. He took to sitting more. Leah learned to shoulder more of the daily burdens, fetching water, tending traps, feeding the horse. She moved with a quiet speed that did not seem hurried but competent. The valley watched and learned new rhythms. The sheriff's report and Margaret's testimonies turned the town toward a legal resolution. The Boones had a number of supporters, men who liked to think themselves owed favors, but the evidence and the witnesses made their claims thin. The sheriff, who had a taste for keeping things clean if not pretty, declared that those who had entered the cabin unlawfully had no rightful claim to the child. He filed the incident and recommended prosecution of the men who had used force. The county courts, slow to move in a place where Winters and the mine's calendar bent calendars, at least had the matter on record. For a while, the law was a slow-moving thing, the kind of animal you feed and then wait for results. The sheriff arranged for Caleb to go to town with a deputy to give formal testimony, while Margaret prepared an affidavit. Hollis and Barlow signed, as promised. The paperwork stacked like kindling, useful, small, and practical. It would not undo the auction nor remedy the market that had made such things possible. It did serve to put the town on record. A man had taken a child from a saloon not as a purchaser, but as a rescuer. Others had witnessed it. Leah watched the legal world in cycles. She did not care for its language, but she lived inside its consequences. Each trip Caleb made to Ridgewater left the cabin a little quieter and a little more precarious, but it also made the official ledger of the place tilt toward them. Weeks passed into months. The wound in Caleb's side knit with slow stitches. It turned first angry and then pale. He grew a little steadier on his feet. Leah's face, hardened by necessity, began to open in small ways. A laugh that was not a reflex, fingers that no longer twitched at shadows. She whittled more birds, dozens, then hundreds of small robins that came to fill the windowsill. Each one took paint in a different way. Some kept the red beak bright, some had blue flecks on the wing. The carved toys filled up the cabin, a forest of small witness pieces. The robin that had been Sarah's sat on the mantel like a relic that had found new use. Caleb learned to measure his days by what he could do that would not undo what stitches had made. He taught Leah to skin a rabbit without flinching, and to cook a more complicated stew, the sort that had herbs and bone, and the slow patience of simmering. He read to her from a ragged moral book he had kept since before his exile, not because the words mattered, but because the ritual of reading together was a thing that set time into kindness. One evening in late summer, as the valley's grass had yellowed and the creek had shrunk to a glinting thread, Leah brought up a question that had been waiting in the corners of their life. They sat on the porch, the robin's shadow long and small between them. The blue gown had been repaired and patched. It now had a new hem where Caleb had worked the needle with clumsy hands. "Will you be my father?" she asked, not with the brittle bluntness that had once measured men in saloon rooms, but with a smallness of hope she had taught herself to keep from falling. Caleb's chest clenched in a way that was almost prayer. He had been trying to avoid the name because it was a weight and a promise and something that might fray. But to avoid the name was to avoid the truth that had grown in the cabin like a sapling pushing through stones. "I will be for you what you need me to be," he said, and the sentence was both a bargain and the best he could do. He did not force the word father as if it were a key to their healing. He let the life they had built do the naming. She considered him, and then pressed the carved robin into his hand, and smiled in a way that made the valley look kinder for a second. "Say it," she said, because children know how to make adults give shape to things. He began and trailed, and then he laughed softly and swallowed. The word came out like a seed. You're my girl, he said, my daughter if you want it. He held the phrase like something fragile and set it in place. It settled in both of them like a small law. The sheriff signed a statement declaring the event of the assault and the names of the attackers. The county papers took time, and the people's memories settled in ways that proofs did not. Regarding formal adoption, the law moved at the pace of the land. A formal complete adoption would require petitions, a home study of sorts by neighbors, and perhaps a county clerk who favored stability. It would take months, but the sheriff's declaration and Margaret's affidavit gave Caleb a standing that had been missing at the auction table, a social proof that said they belonged together. Still, the Boones were not gone. Memory takes time to die, and those who thought themselves owed favors looked for openings. One autumn morning, a messenger came from Ridgewater with a thin envelope and an ugliness in his face. He had news. One of Silas's men had been released on a technicality. There were whispers of a claim about a kinship that might be argued in court. The Boones had hired a lawyer the county regarded as slippery. The law could pull them forward in a way that put their future at risk. Caleb felt the old weather in his chest. The world liked to test him when he tried to make a life that counted. He prepared to go to town for a petition hearing, this time with a handful of witnesses in his pocket and his own voice steadier. Margaret came with him as a witness and a woman of plain statements. Leah, for the first time in public, took her place at the sheriff's side and answered questions. Simple things about where she had slept, who had given her clothes, what had happened at the saloon. Her voice was small but true. The hearing was short and shaped by the slow hand of law. The judge, an old man with sockets like hollowed coins, listened to testimony and then to the Boone side. Legal arguments can be like weather. They move in patterns and sometimes end in rain. Here the scales tilted toward the child who had lived in a cabin where men had defended her life. The judge issued a temporary guardianship that could be later made permanent, and in doing so, he marked the record in a way that made it harder for those with only rumor to take a child by the notion of kinship. The Boones came to the hearing with a face of grievance. They left with a face softened into calculation. The sheriff's authority and Megan and Hollis's sworn words made the Boones' claim a harder thing to press without consequence. The town of Ridgewater, some of it, had chosen a narrative that favored a man who had put himself in harm's way to stop another kind of harm. When the judge signed, Caleb felt the weight of paper like real iron. He thought of $20 like a coin in a river, a small, ugly thing that had set a whole current into motion. He held the paper and swore not in words, but in the pattern of his life to let the child's question, "What will you do to me?" have an answer determined by his acts, not his speech. Winter came like a benediction, and the valley held its breath in white. Snow filled the hollows and made the road a single long ribbon. It was in that quiet that the final legal steps moved with a submission that felt almost merciful. The county clerk, who had first been skeptical of a hermit bringing a child into the law's reach, came to the cabin with a small stack of papers and enough curiosity to make small concessions. Leah sat at the table and watched with a face that had learned the measures of her life. "You will need to sign," the clerk said. "This will be a petition for adoption. There will be a little more to do, but if there are no other claims, we can make it official in time." Caleb stammered, "There are names you promise in the dark, and names you may kneel to sign before witnesses." He had never thought himself the sort of man who would ask to be given a legal tie to another human being. His signature felt both small and massive. He signed with a hand that trembled less than it had the day he paid $20 at the saloon. He thought of the auctioneer's grin, and how simple men had kept other men's lives as if they were trade goods, and he swallowed the brief, bitter taste of that memory. The paper that declared Leah his daughter in a legal sense did not feel like heaven. It felt like a hinge, something that would keep the door closed for those who would otherwise have bargained in the dark. It made the valley into a place that spelled their names together, and not as separate claims. They pinned the papers to the wall above the stove like a map that said there was now a path forward. Spring came slow and then swift. The snow had receded into the hollows and the creek ran full with meltwater. The world smelled like earth and honest labor. Leah ran in the field beside the house, her hair loose for the first time and catching the sun. She wore the blue gown for a day, and it fit her like a small domain. The robin's paint had been refreshed, and 100 little robins stood like a chorus on the sill, each with their own quirks. The adoption hearing was a quiet thing in the county, done in the sheriff's office with people who had watched and had voices. The judge read the declaration, and then, in a small formality that felt almost sacred, he said the words that made them more than a man and a child who had survived. "You may call this child your daughter," the judge said, and the words landed like the end of a long plow. Leah looked at Caleb with a face that had grown in certainty. "You are my dad," she said, and the world tilted in the way that small, perfect certainties do. He had thought he would feel relief, but what came instead was a stitch of the deeper thing. Gratitude and a rounded sense of responsibility. The word dad folded into his life like a tool that fit his hand. They did not have a feast or a parade. They went home and hung the official paper in a place of honor. Margaret knocked on the door with a pie and a grin. The sheriff gave a small nod of approval. The county clerk wrote the final note and then shook Caleb's hand with the same blunt kindness he'd used for many men. "You did right," the sheriff said. "Not all men would." They kept living in the measure of small days. The valley accepted them like a community that had learned a new story to tell its children. Leah earned a new name, no longer the girl who had been sold, but Leah Frost, which sounded to Caleb like something he had earned and not bought. When she signed her name for the first time in the ledger at Margaret's shop, she added a flourish and then laughed, and the sound made both of them know the long arc of healing was not a straight line, but a road they were willing to walk. Years grew on them. The robin sat on the mantel with its paint rubbed smooth, a small relic that had traveled through the worst. The blue gown faded in the sun and was eventually recut into a smaller dress for spring. Leah grew into her hands and into skills that both aided and surprised Caleb. She hunted and she whittled, and she could read the clouds like someone who had been taught to recognize weather as a kind of promise. One afternoon, in a year when the thaw came early and the stream ran like quicksilver, Leah walked to the fence with a small collar in her hand. It was a simple strip of leather with a carved robin button Caleb had made. She fastened it around the horse's bridle, and then, with a boldness that had been born of survival and small pleasures, she slipped it around her own wrist where it fit like a promise. "I don't want a fine locket," she announced without asking. "I want something plain that says I belonged." Caleb watched her and felt the warmth of a man who had found a life returned like a harvest. He put his hand on her shoulder and let his fingers find the small carved robin she held, the one he'd given her the night they had first come to the cabin. The bird had been whittled years before, its paint now rubbed, its edges softened by touch. "You belong," Caleb said, and the sentence seemed less like a contract and more like sunlight. "You always have." She laughed, and then, in a small, serious way, asked the old question again, not to reopen an old wound, but to see how far they had come. "What would you do to me now?" she asked, the words carrying the memory of that night in the saloon, and the sharpness of the first time she'd asked with no safety to cushion it. Caleb's reply was not a grand speech. It did not need to be. He took the robin carving from his pocket, the small one he had never stopped carrying, and set it into her palm. "I will keep you with my hands and my life," he said. "I will teach you how to whittle and how to read the creek, and how to stand when people say you are only a thing to be traded. I will be the sort of man who answers that question with work." They sat on the fence and looked down the valley. A pair of robins chased each other like red-capped punctuation in the air above the thawing field. Leah tightened the little leather around her wrist and then slid it onto Caleb's forearm like a token. He took it and felt his own hands, less free than they'd been once, more full. The valley stretched. It was the same land that had been cruel and necessary and kind at different times. They were a part of its grammar now. In the end, the $20 on the saloon table became less a purchase and more an inciting debt. It had been the mistake that forced him to choose a way of life he had hidden from for years. The question the girl first asked, "What will you do to me?" had not been answered with a single sentence, but with a lifetime of acts. Bandages, hours at a window, witness names on a book, heavy wooden chairs moved against doors, the slow work of signatures and sleep, and every small ritual of safety. Years later, when Leah took a child in her care in turn, a neighbor's niece whose family had suffered a fire. She told the child the story of how a man once paid $20 to take a life out of a saloon and bring her to a cabin where the stove burned steady. She told it not as a legend, but as a lesson in the economy of choices. Sometimes one coin bought a chance to be better. Oftener it bought a reminder of the cost of inaction. At the cabin, on the mantel, the robin sat with its paint worn like a smile. The blue dress swung on a peg, faded beyond the stitches. The papers were framed and hung with careful hands. Outside, the valley rolled and the seasons moved into their honest business. Caleb and Leah walked often down the lane together, and neighbors who once glanced with measured opinions now nodded like old friends. Margaret's shop remained a place of stitches and small goods, and the sheriff kept his book clean in the way a man will when he means to keep a promise. When the evening fell and the light went gray, and the wind turned sweet with the smell of thaw, they would sometimes sit on the stoop and let the valley speak. Leah would whittle little birds and hand one to Caleb, who would tuck it in his pocket as if it were an amulet. Sometimes she would ask the question again, not to test him, but to remind herself how sharp the world could be and how durable they'd become. "What will you do to me?" she would ask, and he would answer the same way he'd always tried to, with hands that worked, with nights kept, with the legal papers that made them more than rumor. "I will keep you," he would say. "I will be here." And in that promise, made not by a coin but by the long work of staying, they both found their answer. If anyone ever asked the story of the man who paid $20 for a little girl, the telling would always end in the same way, with a carved robin on a mantel, a faded blue dress on a peg, a county clerk's signature pinned to the wall, and a daughter who grew into her name because a man chose, again and again, to do the work of being present. If this story moved you, subscribe for more cinematic tales and share which moment hit you hardest.